All right, here we are for chapter 12. Chapter 12 is entitled The South Expands Slavery and Society from 1800 to 1860. This is the last chapter for Unit 4. It begins on page 376. Within this chapter, there are four different sections. The first section is the domestic slave trade, in which we'll look at the Upper South export slaves and the impact on blacks. Section 2 is the world of Southern whites that focuses on the dual cultures of the planter elite and planters, smallholding yeomen, and tenants. Section 3 is the expanding and governing the South, the settlement of Texas, and the politics of democracy. And then the fourth section, which will lead us into the Civil War, is the African American world, evangelical Black Protestantism, forging families and communities, negotiating rights, and the free Black population. One question I want you to keep in mind as you're listening/reading along is the big question. How did the creation of a cotton-based economy change the lives of whites and blacks in all regions of the South? That's a pretty significant question, and that is one that we will have a discussion about. So be prepared to discuss that. Sorry, I see my eyebrows looking kind of wonky. I can grow a lot of hair on my eyebrows, but not on the top of my head. Don't understand it. Okay, so kind of the introduction to this chapter. It reads, life in South Carolina had been good to James Lyde, a slave-owning planter along the Petey River. Lyde and his wife raised 12 children and long resisted the Alabama fever that prompted thousands of Carolinians to move west. Finally, at age 65, probably seeking land for his many offspring, he moved his slaves and family, including 6 children and 6 grandchildren, to a plantation near Montgomery, Alabama. There, the family lived initially in a squalid log cabin with air holes but no windows. Even after building a new house, the Lyde's life remained unsettled. Pa's quite in the notion of moving somewhere, his daughter Maria reported. Although James Lyde died in Alabama, many of his children moved on. In 1854, at the age of 58, Eli Lyde migrated to Texas, telling his father, "Something within me whispers onward and onward." The Lyde story was that of Southern society. Between 1800 and 1860, white planters moved west and, using the muscles and sweat of 1 million enslaved African Americans, brought millions of acres into cultivation. By 1840, the South was at the cutting edge of the American market revolution. It annually produced and exported 1.5 million bales of raw cotton, over 2/3 of the world's supply, and its economy was larger and richer than that of most nations. Cotton is king, boasted the Southern cultivator. No matter how rich they were, a few cotton planters in Alabama, Mississippi, and Texas lived in elegant houses or led cultured lives. They had forsaken the aristocratic gentility of the Chesapeake and the Carolinas to make money. To sell cotton in order to buy Negroes, to make more cotton to buy more Negroes, ad infinitum is the aim of the thoroughgoing cotton planter. A traveler reported from Mississippi in 1835. His whole soul is wrapped up in the pursuit. Plantation women lamented the loss of genteel surroundings and polite society. Raised in North Carolina, where she was blessed with every comfort and even luxury, Mary Drake found Mississippi and Alabama a dreary waste. Enslaved African Americans knew what dreary waste really meant: unremitting toil, unrelieved poverty, and profound sadness. Sold south from Maryland, where his family had lived for generations, Charles Ball's father became gloomy and morose and ran off and disappeared, with good reason. On new cotton plantations, slaves labored from sunup to sundown, and from one end of the year to the other, forced to work by the threat of the lash. Always wanting more, Southern planters and politicians plotted to extend their plantation economy across the continent. Okay, I've got to move. My arm's going to sleep. The domestic slave trade. In 1817, when the American Colonization Society, and again, that's one you should remember, began to transport a few freed blacks to Africa, the Southern plantation system was expanding rapidly. In 1790, its western boundary ran through the middle of Georgia. By 1830, it stretched through western Louisiana. By 1860, the slave frontier extended far into Texas. That advance of 900 miles more than doubled the geographical area cultivated by slave labor and increased the number of slave states from 8 in 1800 to 15 by 1850. The federal government played a key role in this expansion. It acquired Louisiana from the French in 1803, welcomed the slave states of Mississippi and Alabama into the Union in 1817 and 1819, removed Native Americans from the southeastern states in the 1830s, and annexed Texas and Mexican lands in the 1840s. To cultivate this vast area, white planters imported enslaved laborers first from Africa and then from the Chesapeake region. Between 1776 and 1809, when Congress outlawed the Atlantic slave trade, planters purchased about 115,000 Africans. The planter will sacrifice everything to attain Negroes, declared one slave trader. Despite the influx, the demand for labor far exceeded the supply. Consequently, planters imported new African workers illegally through the Spanish colony of Florida until 1819, and then through the Mexican province of Texas. Yet these Africans, about 50,000 between 1810 and 1865, did not satisfy the demand. So now we'll take a look at the Upper South export slaves, and I would encourage you to take a look at the images on page 379. It shows maps of how the South and slave society expanded in our country. The first map is 1790, the second map is 1830, and then the third map is 1860, where you can get a full view of the continental United States and the stretch of slavery. Planters seeking labor looked to the Chesapeake region, home in 1800 to nearly half of the nation's black population. There, the African American population was growing rapidly from natural increase, an average of 27% a decade by the 1810s, and creating a surplus of enslaved workers on many plantations. The result was a growing domestic trade in slaves. Between 1818 and 1829, planters in just one Maryland tobacco-growing county, Frederick, sold at least 952 slaves to traders or planters. Plantation owners in Virginia disposed of 75,000 slaves during the 1810s and again during the 1820s. The number of forced Virginia migrants jumped to nearly 120,000 during the 1830s and then averaged 85,000 during the 1840s and 1850s. In Virginia alone, then, slave owners ripped 440,000 African Americans from communities where their families had lived for 3 or 4 generations. By 1860, the mania for buying Negroes from the Upper South had resulted in a massive transplantation of more than 1 million slaves. A majority of African Americans now lived and worked in the Deep South, the lands that stretched from Georgia to Texas. The African American migration took 2 forms: transfer and sale. Looking for new opportunities, thousands of Chesapeake and Carolina planters, men like James Lyde, sold their existing plantations and moved their slaves to the Southwest. Many other planters gave slaves to sons and daughters who moved west. Such transfers accounted for about 40% of the African American migrants. The rest, about 60% of the 1 million migrants, were sold south through traders. Just as the Atlantic slave trade enriched English merchants in the 18th century, so the domestic market brought wealth to American traders between 1800 and 1860. One set of routes ran to the Atlantic coast and sent thousands of slaves to sugar plantations in Louisiana, the former French territory that entered the Union in 1812. As sugar output soared, slave traders scoured the countryside near the port cities of Baltimore, Alexandria, Richmond, and Charleston, searching, as one of them put it, for likely young men such as I think would suit the New Orleans market. Each year, hundreds of muscular young slaves passed through auction houses in the port cities bound for the massive trade mart in New Orleans. Because this coastal trade in laborers was highly visible, it elicited widespread condemnation by Northern abolitionists. Coastal trade is a vocabulary term. Sugar was a killer crop, and Louisiana, like the 18th century West Indies, soon had a well-deserved reputation among African Americans as a place of slaughter. Hundreds died each year from disease, overwork, and brutal treatment. Maryland farmer John Anthony, I have no idea how to say his name, Munikhuysen, refused to allow his daughter Priscilla to marry a Louisiana sugar planter, declaring, "Mitt has never been used to see Negroes flayed alive and it would kill her." The inland system, another vocabulary term, that fed slaves to the Cotton South was less visible than the coastal trade, but more extensive. Professional slave traders went from one rural village to another, buying young and likely Negroes. The traders marched their purchases in coffles, columns of slaves bound to one another, to Alabama, Mississippi, and Missouri in the 1830s, and to Arkansas and Texas in the 1850s. One slave described the arduous journey. Dem speculators would put the chillins in a wagon, usually pulled by oxen, and the older folks was chained or tied together so as they could not run off. Once a coffle reached its destination, the trader would sell slaves at every village in the county. Chesapeake and Carolina planters provided the human cargo. Some planters sold slaves when poor management or their own extravagances threw them into debt. Trouble gathers thicker and thicker around me, Thomas B. Chaplin of South Carolina lamented in his diary. I will be compelled to send about 10 prime Negroes to town on next Monday to be sold. Many more planters doubled as slave traders, earning substantial profits by traveling south to sell some of their slaves and those of their neighbors. Thomas Weatherly of South Carolina drove his surplus slaves to Hayneville, Alabama, where he sold 10 Negroes. Colonel E.S. Irvine, a member of the South Carolina legislature and a highly respected gentleman in white circles, likewise traveled frequently to sell a drove of Negroes. Prices marched in step with those for cotton. During a boom year in the 1850s, a planter noted that a slave will fetch $1,000 cash quickly. The domestic slave trade was crucial to the prosperity of the migrating white planters because it provided workers to fell the forests and plant cotton in the Gulf states. Equally important, it sustained the wealth of slave owners in the Upper South by selling surplus black workers. Tobacco, rice, and grain producers in the Chesapeake and Carolinas added about 20% to their income. As a Maryland newspaper remarked in 1858, the trade serves as an almost universal resource to raise money. A prime, able-bodied slave is worth 3 times as much to the cotton or sugar planter as to the Maryland agriculturalist. Sorry. Next, the impact on blacks. For African American families, the domestic slave trade was a personal disaster that underlined their status and vulnerability as chattel slaves. In law, they were the movable personal property of the whites who owned them. As Lewis Clark, a fugitive from slavery, noted, "Many a time I had them say to me, 'You're my property.' The being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle," declared former slave James W.C. Pennington. As a South Carolina master put it, "The slave's earnings belong to me because I bought him." Slave property underpinned the entire Southern economic system. Whig politician Henry Clay, and that's someone I want you to make sure you note, he will become more and more important as we progress through our chapters heading to the Civil War. He noted that the immense amount of capital which is invested in slave property is owned by widows and orphans, by the aged and infirm, as well as the sound and vigorous. It is the subject of mortgages, deeds of trust, and family settlements. Clay concluded, "I know that there is a visionary dogma which holds that Negro slaves cannot be the subject of property, but that is property which the law declares to be property." As a slave owner, Clay also knew that property rights were key to slave discipline. "I govern them without the whip," another master explained, "by stating that I shall sell them if they do not conduct themselves as I wish." The threat was effective. "The Negroes here dread nothing on earth so much as this," a Maryland observer noted. "They regard the South with perfect horror, and to be sent there is considered as the worst punishment." Thousands of slaves suffered that fate, which destroyed about 1 in every 4 slave marriages. "Why does the slave ever love?" asked a black abolitionist Harriet Jacobs in her autobiography, Instance in the Life of a Slave Girl, "when her partner may at any moment be wrenched away by the hand of violence." After being sold, one Georgia slave lamented, "My dear wife, for you and my children, my pen cannot express the grief," I think that means grief, "I feel to be parted from you all." The interstate slave trade often focused on young adults. In northern Maryland, planters sold away boys and girls at an average age of 17 years. I'll try it with the accent now. "They sold my sister Kate," Anna Harris remembered decades later, "and I ain't seen or heard of her since." The trade also separated almost a third of all slave children under the age of 14 from one or both of their parents. Sarah Grant remembered, Mama used to cry when she had to go back to work because she was always scared some of us kids would be sold while she was away. Well, might she worry, for slave traders worked quickly. One night I lay down on the straw mattress with my mama, Vinnie Baker recalled, and the next morning I woke up and she was gone. When their owner sold 7-year-old Laura Clark and 10 other children from their plantation in North Carolina, Clark sensed that she would see her mother no more in this life. Despite these sales, 75% of slave marriages remained unbroken, and the majority of children lived with one or both parents until puberty. Consequently, the sense of family among African Americans remained strong. Sold from Virginia to Texas in 1843, Hawkins Wilson carried with him a mental picture of his family. 25 years later, and now a freedman, Wilson set out to find his dearest relatives in Virginia. My sister belonged to Peter Coleman in Caroline County, and her name was Jane. She had 3 children, Robert, Charles, and Julia, which, when I left, Sister Martha belonged to Dr. Jefferson. Sister Matilda belonged to Mrs. Watts. During the decades between sale and freedom, Hawkins Wilson and thousands of other African Americans constructed new lives for themselves in the Mississippi Valley. Undoubtedly, many did so with a sense of foreboding, knowing from personal experience that their owners could disrupt their lives at any moment. Like Charles Ball, some longed to die and escape from the bonds of my tormentors. The darkness of slavery shadowed even moments of joy. Knowing that sales often ended slave marriages, a white minister blessed one couple for so long as God keeps them together. Many white planters saw only the African American marriages that endured and ignored those they had broken. Accordingly, many owners consider themselves benevolent masters, and benevolent masters is a vocabulary term you need to know, committed to the welfare of my family, black and white. Some masters gave substance to this paternalistic ideal by treating kindly, loyal, and worthy slaves. Black overseers, the Mamie who raised their children and trusted house servants. By preserving the families of these slaves, many planters could believe that they sold South only coarse troublemakers and uncivilized slaves who had little sense of family. Other owners were more honest about the human cost of their pursuit of wealth. Tomorrow, the Negroes are to get off to Kentucky, a slave-owning woman in Virginia wrote to a friend, and I expect there will be great crying and moaning with children, leaving their mothers their children, and women their husbands. Whether or not they acknowledged the slave's pain, few Southern whites questioned the morality of the slave trade. Responding to abolitionist criticism, the City Council of Charleston, South Carolina, declared that the removal of slaves from place to place and their transfer from master to master by gift was completely consistent with moral principle and with the highest order of civilization. So in the next installment, we're going to take a look at the world of Southern whites. I'm going to take a little break before I do the next broadcast. Allow y'all to catch up on some vocabulary and some note taking, right? Right? Yeah, I really do hope you are. And when you come back to class, you'll be glad you did. Right, Baxter? Right? Right? What do you think? Say hi to the kids. Hi, Baxter. All right. Peace.